Have you noticed? A nation never collapses with noise. It collapses in silence. When bridges start to rust, no one pays attention. When hospitals cut hours due to budget shortages, people think it's just temporary. When rural schools shut down one by one, we say, there are fewer kids anyway. But then one day we look around and realize an entire state has turned into an economic zombie, surviving only on the last breath from Washington. This isn't a prediction. This is reality, unfolding now. I've seen it coming. There are states in America where just one shock, a recession, a bankruptcy, a collapse in industry, is enough to make the entire social structure crumble like a sandcastle struck by waves. You don't have to wait for America to fall. The unraveling has already started from within, and it doesn't start in New York or California. It begins in places the federal government doesn't even mention on the news, the places left behind, where budgets fall short, people move away, and loyalty erodes day by day under the weight of despair. Here is the list of 10 states that will fall before America even has time to panic. And if you live in one of them, you might already be standing too close to the edge without realizing it. Number 10. Mississippi. Mississippi isn't dead, it's just no longer alive. When people think of collapse, they picture something dramatic, a financial earthquake, a modern civil war, or a mass bankruptcy. But Mississippi shows a different kind of collapse, slow, silent, and irreversible. A biological breakdown like an aging body that can no longer pump enough blood to its distant limbs. You can drive for hours through its ghost towns and never see an investment firm, a tech company, or any sign of a 21st century economy. Mississippi is the poorest state in America. But the issue isn't just poverty, it's exhaustion. When nearly 1 in 5 people live below the poverty line, when more than 45% of working-age adults are no longer working, you're not just looking at a sluggish economy, you're staring at a society that's given up. And the scariest part is that nobody seems to care. Mississippi has no key industries for the nation to worry about, no major corporations for the media to spotlight, no strong economic indicators worth rescuing. It exists like a ghost within the federal system, a state with a glorious past but a decaying present so severe that the central government almost treats it as a burden to be hidden. I used to think the greatest injustice was poverty, but in Mississippi I realized the greatest injustice is being forgotten. Schools close down without protest, hospitals go bankrupt, leaving only makeshift clinics, roads crumble, yet people still drive over them as if it's part of daily survival. If America has a ground zero for economic contagion, this is the first crack. Mississippi doesn't need another crisis to fall. It just needs a slight breeze from the national labor market. And when that breeze comes, the whole state will fall without a sound. Only the silence of a society too used to not being heard. Number 9. Louisiana. Louisiana is a theatrical lie dressed in neon lights, jazz music, and the scent of oil. On the surface, it's alive. There are still festivals, still tourism, still oil fields pumping black gold like the old days. But beneath the makeup lies a body decaying in every financial joint, every public service cell, every social artery so thin it could burst from the slightest squeeze. People often talk about the charm of New Orleans, but few dare admit that most of Louisiana has been left behind by the global economy. This state isn't just poor, it's dependent on oil and gas, an industry with no loyalty. When the world market shifts, when OPEC makes a decision, the entire state trembles. There's no diversity, no alternative tech base, no strong middle class to carry the burden. Louisiana is like an old sailboat. Beautiful, but one lost breeze away from drifting into nothingness. I once met a man in Baton Rouge, an oil engineer, 55 years old. Used to earn 6 figures a year. Now he drives Uber and lives on temporary welfare, saying, "One market crash was enough to set me back 20 years. And he wasn't an outlier. He was the standard. The state's infrastructure isn't any better. Schools rank near the bottom nationwide. The healthcare system lacks doctors. The roads are so decayed that a heavy rain can drown entire counties in chaos. But what makes Louisiana most dangerous isn't its present. It's how little it can endure when the future shakes, when national recession hits. States with strong local economies will brace and survive. But Louisiana, it'll sink without a sound, Because its reserves are nearly empty, its resilience is nearly gone, and its people are too worn out to keep fighting a system that only drains them dry and leaves them behind. A state can survive being poor, but no state survives losing its will, and Louisiana, in many ways, has already started losing itself long ago. Number 8. Michigan, once a symbol of American prosperity, and now the clearest evidence of the silent collapse of an industrial empire. Some places don't die because they were attacked, but because they were forgotten. Michigan is one of them. From above, Detroit still shines with lights, assembly lines still move, and press conferences about innovation and green tech still take place regularly. But I've walked the empty streets of Flint, of Saginaw, of Pontiac, and I saw one thing clearly. If you look long enough at a place that was once great, you'll see that the sadness called decline never screams. It whispers. Michigan is where collapse didn't come from a financial explosion, but from the slow erosion of an old dream. People once believed the auto industry would sustain generations, and it did. But then the world shifted, and Michigan, instead of adapting, clung to the outdated like a child holding a picture of a lost father. I've seen entire neighborhoods abandoned, grass growing past the windows, houses boarded shut, like a graveyard of the working class. And don't let surface statistics fool you. Yes, there's recovery, there's investment. There are a few new companies, but when over 38% of the population is classified as financially distressed, unable to pay bills, defaulting on credit cards, or facing eviction, you're not a state in progress. You're a drowning state, trying to keep your head above water while smiling for the cameras. The biggest problem in Michigan isn't money, it's depletion. When a society goes through enough cycles of recession, losing jobs, losing homes, losing hope, they don't just grow poorer, they lose the ability to believe things can get better. And strategically, I believe that's the most dangerous thing. When people stop believing in the future, every economic model becomes meaningless. Michigan is still alive, but only because its shadow from the past is large enough to make people think everything's fine. But the truth is different. The cars still run, but the dream is out of gas. And if the U.S. economy takes another dive, Michigan won't fall from the push. It'll fall because it's been standing too long on legs so tired no one bothers to check if blood still flows. Number 7. Texas, a state long seen as America's final stronghold in times of crisis. Until you see the cracks spreading right beneath those cowboy boots, Texas has always defined itself in 2 words: raw power. But I've learned something from watching the collapse of many empires. True strength isn't the loudest scream, it's the longest endurance in silence. And Texas, though it looks like an unbeatable giant, is actually standing on sandy soil. Vast, solid, but far more fragile than people think. Yes, Texas has the second largest GDP in the U.S. But ask the people in western towns where the oil wells are drying up, where farmers live off federal aid, and where the nearest hospital is over 100 kilometers away. They won't talk about strength. They'll talk about exhaustion, about unpaid medical bills, about the second job they took to make up for soaring gas prices. And I understand that, because the bigger a system grows, the more pieces it leaves behind. While Austin and Dallas shine with tech and urban growth, dozens of smaller Texas counties are turning into social deserts. No education, no services, no future. That asymmetry is something I can't overlook. It's a signal of a collapse not from outside, but from within. Someone once told me, Texas is the land of opportunity. I don't disagree. But what kind of opportunity, when 36% of residents are drowning in bad debt and personal bankruptcy? What kind of opportunity, when wages can't keep up with housing costs, when working 2 jobs a day still doesn't pay for a doctor's visit? When schools lack teachers and the power grid once collapsed over a winter storm? Texas prides itself on no income tax. But look at the cost. A welfare budget as thin as paper, private hospitals carrying the burden of public health, and critical infrastructure, power, water, roads, always on the brink of collapse. What worries me most is how Texas hides its weaknesses behind speed. Growth moves like a windstorm, but no one builds a foundation out of wind. If the U.S. economy falls, Texas won't break from lack of money. It'll break from the tension of being stretched too far between a superpower image and a fractured reality. And I believe there's nothing more dangerous than a state that believes too deeply in its own legend. Because by then it no longer sees the truth, only the rankings. And history never forgives those who think they're untouchable. Number 6. Illinois, a state not poor like Mississippi, not dependent like Louisiana, and not collapsing under speed like Texas. Illinois is falling in a more unique way. Through the very promises that once made it look strong, this is the scariest kind of collapse, a fracture in faith in governance. And as always, I won't sugarcoat it. Illinois isn't breaking due to lack of resources. It has plenty. It didn't fall from a lack of history. Chicago was once the engine of America, but it cracked because of something invisible: promises. For decades, Illinois built an enormous structure of welfare and pensions like a castle made of glass, beautiful, attractive, and dangerous. They promised care for retirees, guarantees for public health care, for teachers, for civil servants, and then they couldn't pay. Illinois now holds over $140 billion in pension debt, a number no longer a warning, but a sealed indictment. I don't need to guess. I just look at the numbers and I see. No state in the U.S. has a pension fund as underfunded, as embarrassingly low as Illinois, and it's spreading like a disease. I used to think a state just needed financial capability to survive. But Illinois taught me something deeper. When people lose faith in the tax system and government, they leave, and they did. Illinois has lost population for over a decade, and it wasn't the poorest who left first. It was the informed middle class, the ones who knew they'd never see returns on what they paid in, the ones who realized they were being held hostage in a tug-of-war between bottomless budgets and suffocating taxes. You could tell me Chicago is still strong, still a tech and financial hub in the Midwest, but step into the suburbs, into counties cutting police budgets, closing public libraries, where students go online not because of a pandemic, but because schools can't afford electricity. You'll understand, the collapse here isn't loud, it's a slow erosion of trust, of services, of the system. And what alarms me more than any other state is this. In Illinois, collapse isn't external. It comes from the power structure itself. When a state survives by raising taxes just to plug holes. When lawmakers knowingly sign promises they can't keep just to stay in office. That's no longer failure, it's systemic betrayal. If the U.S. economy crashes, Illinois won't just be a casualty, it will be a symbol of a model that promised too much, taxed too little, and treated its people like a bottomless wallet, and no one forgives those who erode public trust just to keep the show going. Number 5. Hawaii, the place the world sees, smiles, but where the natives live in a quiet struggle. People call Hawaii paradise, but I call it an economic illusion built with outsider money and insider tears. Nowhere else in America is the gap between appearance and reality more painful. Gorgeous beaches, glamorous hotels, tourists from all over the world pour in, but behind the postcards is a society curling inward under the weight of the highest cost of living in the United States. I'm not saying this to be dramatic. I'm saying it because I've heard the same story dozens of times from locals. We've lived here all our lives. Now we can't afford rent. My kids had to move to the mainland. I don't recognize this island anymore. Hawaii has no major manufacturing, no significant exports. It relies on one thing: tourism, and nothing is more fragile than an economy dependent on the desires of the wealthy elsewhere. A pandemic, a wildfire, an airline disruption, and the entire supply chain collapses. It's not just hotels shutting down. It's grocery stores with empty shelves. It's people unable to buy gas. It's medicine, milk, medical supplies, everything priced beyond reason. When the pandemic hit, Hawaii didn't just quarantine from the virus. It was cut off from economic survival. And I believe that was a warning no one wanted to hear. The issue isn't just high prices. The issue is that Hawaii's entire model of existence works against its own people. Wages don't keep up with costs. Housing is swallowed by mainland speculators. Young people must choose, leave or live with parents into middle age. And then one day you realize the island is still beautiful, but it's no longer Hawaii's. It has become a playground for the wealthy to spend, and a burden carried quietly by its residents. I don't believe in an endless tourism dream without foundation. And Hawaii is the perfect example of that. When the national economy shakes, states with agriculture, industry, or tech will struggle and recover. But Hawaii? It doesn't produce, it doesn't self-sustain. It has no plan B. One shock, a federal budget cut, an airline crisis, or a tourism downturn is enough to bring the whole system down. And the most painful part? People will still come here, still take photos, still call it paradise. While beneath that picture, a native mother stands in line at a food bank just to survive the week. Number 4. Nevada, where the dazzling lights of Las Vegas make people forget that the brightest things are often the most fragile. This is the kind of state that grows like wildfire when things are good, but when the wind shifts, it doesn't slide, it collapses. And I'm not saying that for drama, I'm saying it because it's starting to happen. Nevada is a professional gambler, and it's betting everything on a game that never promises a win. Behind the luxury of Las Vegas, behind the casinos that never sleep, is an economy almost entirely dependent on the presence of those with money to spare. No tourists, no Nevada. It sounds simple, but when a state puts its entire economic lifeline into entertainment and leisure, it's no longer a state. It's a gamble. And in that gamble, everyday citizens are never the ones dealing the cards. I once stood on the Strip at 3 a.m., the lights still on, the music still blaring, drunk tourists laughing like tomorrow didn't exist. But just a few blocks away were cramped low-income apartments, where housekeepers, casino security, and cab drivers caught a few hours of sleep before the next shift. Not for dreams, but for survival. They live next to the casinos, but far from opportunity. Because when an economy only draws money from outsiders, it's no longer a playground for residents. It's a gilded trap. Nevada has no income tax. Sounds great, right? But because of that, the state budget relies almost entirely on consumer taxes and tourism revenue. When crisis hits, like in 2008 or during the 2020 pandemic, this state doesn't just get hurt. It gets paralyzed, healthcare budgets slashed, schools closed, government employees laid off. And I think that's the clearest proof that a flashy economy doesn't equal a resilient system. People say Vegas bounces back fast, true, on the surface. But many communities outside the urban glow have yet to recover. And when a state develops too wide a gap between the bright center and the dim outskirts, that's no longer growth. That's latent instability. I don't criticize Nevada for relying on tourism, but I speak up because no one wants to admit that this is one of the weakest states in America when it comes to healthcare, education, and reserves. When the global economy stumbles, states like Nevada, with no production, no robust internal safety net, will be the first to feel the blow. And I fear that the next time disaster strikes, the lights in Vegas might still shine. But behind the curtain, an entire generation may be living in the dark. Number 3. Kentucky, a place that doesn't scream, doesn't make headlines, but is the perfect example of silent collapse, where society rots from within, yet no one notices because the hills still look green on the outside. That's why I see Kentucky as one of the most dangerous states if the U.S. economy stumbles, because it won't fall like a stone column. It'll dissolve like soil eroded by rain. If you want to know whether a nation is failing, don't look at the capital. Drive through Kentucky, through roads with no lights, towns where once there were factories and now there's only a gas station and a single pharmacy. Kentucky is where collapse doesn't need war or financial storms, it just needs time. Because when you combine industrial withdrawal, an exhausted education system, and a fleeing youth population, you no longer ask if it will collapse, but when. I once thought poverty was a phase, but Kentucky showed me there are places where poverty is a structure, a part of the ecosystem. There are communities where 3 generations live on assistance, where opioids aren't a drug, they're an escape plan. When you have a state with one of the highest dependency rates on the federal government, where healthcare in the mountains is almost non-existent, where bridges shake like brittle bones under a single truck. You don't need a national crisis, just a sneeze from Washington is enough to shatter it. What haunts me most when thinking about Kentucky isn't that they're poor, it's that no one is investing in their return to prosperity. The industries that once supported this state, coal mining, manufacturing, have all been outsourced, replaced by promises of digital transformation, new skills, green jobs. But let me ask you, how many tech firms are headquartered in Hazard? How many Louisville graduates are ready to return to the mountains and start a business? Not many, because no one wants to invest in a place where the future is a luxury. And that's why Kentucky isn't just a poor state. It's a symbol of what happens when a country has no plan for the communities it left behind. I believe the U.S. economy will face another crisis. That's not pessimism, it's the cycle. And when it happens, Kentucky won't just suffer, it will free fall. Not because of its own mistakes, but because it's been branded as too small to save, too weak to stand. And I fear that no one in government will have the courage to say that out loud. Number 2. Alabama, a state where honor and tradition are spoken of more than long-term planning. But the problem with honor is, it doesn't pay hospital bills, it doesn't stop floods, and it doesn't keep the younger generation from leaving. I'm not here to attack a state. I'm here to point out what no one wants to say. Alabama is sliding downward, and what makes it dangerous is the false belief that everything will be fine. Alabama is a state with deep pride, and that's also what keeps it stuck in its own sinking ground. Here, tradition is elevated to identity. But in the modern world, identity without infrastructure, without education, without adaptability, is just a beautiful shadow of the past. I've seen towns in Alabama where abandoned houses stand beside old churches, where bumpy roads lead to neighborhoods with no medical centers left. And when you realize that over 40% of a state's roads and bridges are rated poor or barely acceptable, you don't need a natural disaster to know trouble is coming. The education system here isn't doing much better. Graduation rates are low, teachers are lacking, and technical training is almost non-existent in rural areas. And I'm not talking about individual failure. This is structural failure. A budget model with no strategic investment, where schools scramble for funding and people have to choose between medication and tuition. Alabama ranks near the bottom of the country in healthcare, something nearly unacceptable in a G7 nation. But what worries me more than the statistics is the normalization. When a society becomes too used to waiting 45 minutes for an ambulance, to pregnancies without OB doctors, to 3-day power outages treated like normal, that's when it enters its most dangerous phase, when instability becomes ordinary. I once believed that technology and capital investment could help a state like Alabama rise again, but now I understand. If the system doesn't change how it views its own people, every investment will vanish into an outdated bureaucracy. Alabama depends on the federal government at an alarming level, from education and healthcare to welfare. If the federal budget gets slashed during a recession, which is inevitable, Alabama has no net beneath it, no strong reserve fund, no stable revenue base, no private sector backbone to catch tens of thousands of families in crisis. I don't hate Alabama. On the contrary, I feel sorrow for it, because this is one of the states with the kindest people I've ever met. But kindness doesn't hold a state up, and in the real world, no one comes to rescue those who refuse to help themselves first. When America enters its next period of uncertainty, Alabama may be the first place we hear cracking, not because it's weak, but because it hasn't dared to face its weaknesses for far too long. Number 1. West Virginia, where I believe collapse is no longer a theory or future warning. It has already begun, quietly, heartbeat by heartbeat. In this list, it's not the weakest state, but it's falling the fastest, and the scariest part is, no one outside can hear it fall. West Virginia is a land of mountains, of hard work, of a coal mining history that once fueled a nation. But all of that now lives only in history books, in memories, in stories told by elderly folks who never left the hollers. Today, when you step foot here, the first thing you feel isn't poverty, it's emptiness. The silence is chilling, as if the land itself has accepted its fate, a state abandoned. West Virginia has the lowest labor force participation in the U.S. Less than 55% of adults here are working or even looking for work. That's not a statistic, that's a death knell. When a society no longer believes in work, no longer sees a future worth chasing, every recovery program is just an empty slogan. I walked through an old coal town, dozens of empty homes, closed supermarkets, churches with no one left to pray. Kids growing up here no longer dream of becoming engineers, doctors, or entrepreneurs. They just want to leave, and if they succeed, they won't come back. The healthcare system here has entered what I call a system that exists, but does not serve. Many counties have no hospitals. Emergency services must wind through mountains for hours. The overdose death rate is the highest in the nation. Mental health issues are rampant. And when people talk about public health, here, it's a distant luxury. People don't die from war, but from being forgotten in peace. And the cruelest truth? An entire generation is paying the price for systems that no longer work. West Virginia lives in the past, but death comes from its inability to buy a future. There's no replacement industry for coal, no wave of tech investment, no universities expanding here. Even the military doesn't recruit from this region like it used to. That tells me one thing: the central system is let go. 1/3 of the state's budget comes from the federal government. What happens when that budget gets cut? What happens when a national recession forces Washington to choose? Save a place with recovery potential, or save a place that can no longer save itself? The answer is cold, but it's clear. And I don't believe West Virginia will be the one chosen. This is the only state on this list where I truly believe if a national economic crisis hits, entire regions won't just suffer, they'll dissolve permanently, not because they did something wrong, but because the system quietly decided they're no longer strategically valuable enough to save. A society deemed no longer worth investing in is already dead, even if it still breathes. 10 states, 10 different structures, but the same outcome. Slowly losing the ability to exist in a nation built for places that can stand on their own. Some die from poverty, some from dependency, some from mismanagement, and others because their people no longer believe they deserve a future. I didn't write this list to cause panic. I wrote it as a strategy guide, because if you don't know which places fall first, you'll be the next one standing at the edge. Don't let city lights fool you. Don't let growth stats make you complacent, and never believe your home is untouchable. History doesn't need war to wipe a state off the map of opportunity. It just needs a few more years of budget cuts, a few dry seasons, and a lingering crisis of belief. If you live in a place like that, the question is no longer, what if a crisis happens? But how much time do I have left to prepare? And if you live somewhere that seems stable, look closer at the signs around you. Are there still enough teachers in your schools? Are hospitals cutting services? Is your population quietly leaving? Don't wait until you look around and your neighbors are gone. An empire never collapses from a single blow. It collapses from too many unattended weaknesses. And in the game of global strategy, America won't fall because a big state stumbles. It will fall because 10 small ones collapse at once. And no one can save 10 shadows when the last light goes out. So what about you? Are you sure you're still standing in the light? Or are you slowly stepping into the dark without even knowing it?